Hello, and welcome to the To Be Like Christ Bible Study Podcast, where we explore and explain the Bible one chapter at a time. My name is Luke, and I'm your host. Today's chapter is Genesis 19. Let's read the text together. I'm going to be reading from the English Standard Version, and while I find it in my Bible, if you have a moment, hit the subscribe button on your podcast player so we can study together again sometime. I will tell you before we begin that if you usually listen to this podcast with your children, there may be some themes that they're not ready to hear, some more mature themes. Genesis 19 definitely has some of those, so parental advisory before we begin the text and discuss it. Genesis 19 has 38 verses. Let's go ahead and read the text. The two angels came to Sodom in the evening, and Lot was sitting in the gate of Sodom. When Lot saw them, he rose to meet them and bowed himself with his face to the earth and said, "My lords, please turn aside to your servant's house and spend the night and wash your feet. Then you may rise up early and go on your way." They said, "No, we will spend the night in the town square." But he pressed them strongly, so they turned aside to him and entered into his house. And he made them a feast and baked unleavened bread, and they ate. But before they lay down, the men of the city, the men of Sodom, both young and old, all the people to the last man, surrounded the house. And they called to Lot, "Where are the men who came to you tonight? Bring them out to us, that we may know them." Lot went out to the men at the entrance, shut the door after him, and said, "I beg you, my brothers, do not act so wickedly. Behold, I have two daughters who have not known any man. Let me bring them out to you, and do to them as you please. Only do nothing to these men, for they have come under the shelter of my roof." But they said, "Stand back." And they said, "This fellow came to sojourn, and he has become the judge. Now we will deal worse with you than with them." Then they pressed hard against the man Lot, and drew near to break down the door. But the men reached out their hands and brought Lot into the house with them and shut the door. And they struck with blindness the men who were at the entrance of the house, both small and great, so that they wore themselves out groping for the door. Then the men said to Lot, "Have you anyone else here, sons-in-law, sons, daughters, or anyone you have in the city? Bring them out of the place. For we are about to destroy this place, because the outcry against its people has become great before the Lord, and the Lord has sent us to destroy it." So Lot went out and said to his sons-in-law, who were to marry his daughters, "Up, get out of this place, for the Lord is about to destroy the city." But he seemed to his sons-in-law to be jesting. As morning dawned, the angels urged Lot, saying, "Up, take your wife and your two daughters who are here, lest you be swept away in the punishment of the city." But he lingered. So the men seized him and his wife and his two daughters by the hand, the Lord being merciful to him, and they brought him out and set him outside the city. And as they brought them out, one said, "Escape for your life. Do not look back or stop anywhere in the valley. Escape to the hills, lest you be swept away." And Lot said to them, "Oh no, my lords. Behold, your servant has found favor in your sight, and you have shown me great kindness in saving my life. But I cannot escape to the hills, lest the disaster overtake me and I die. Behold, this city is near enough to flee to, and it is a little one. Let me escape there. Is it not a little one? And my life will be saved." And they said to him, "Behold, I grant you this favor also, that I will not overthrow the city of which you have spoken. Escape there quickly, for I can do nothing till you arrive there." Therefore the name of the city was called Zoar. The sun had risen on the earth when Lot came to Zoar. Then the Lord rained on Sodom and Gomorrah sulfur and fire from the Lord out of heaven. And he overthrew those cities and all the valley, and all the inhabitants of the cities, and what grew on the ground. But Lot's wife behind him looked back, and she became a pillar of salt. And Abraham went early in the morning to the place where he stood before the Lord, and he looked down towards Sodom and Gomorrah and towards all the land of the valley. And he looked, and behold, the smoke of the land went up like the smoke of a furnace. So it was that when God destroyed the cities of the valley, God remembered Abraham and sent Lot out of the midst of the overthrow, and he overthrew the cities in which Lot had lived. Now Lot went up out of Zoar and lived in the hills, and his two daughters, for he was afraid to live in Zoar. So he lived in a cave with his two daughters. And the firstborn said to the younger, "Our father is old, and there is not a man on earth to come in to us after the manner of all the earth. Come, let us make our father drink wine, and we will lie with him, that we may preserve offspring from our father." So they made their father drink wine that night, and the firstborn went in and lay with her father. He did not know when she lay down or when she arose. The next day the firstborn said to the younger, Behold, I lay last night with my father. Let us make him drink wine tonight also. Then you go in and lie with him, that we may preserve offspring from our father. So they made their father drink wine that night also, and the younger arose and lay with him, and he did not know when she lay down or when she arose. Thus both the daughters of Lot became pregnant by their father. The firstborn bore a son and called his name Moab. He is the father of the Moabites to this day. The younger also bore a son and called his name Ben-Ami. He is the father of the Ammonites to this day. So this is the story of Genesis chapter 19, the somewhat famous story of Sodom and Gomorrah. I imagine a lot of people, even if not Christians or maybe not growing up in churches, have heard the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, and it comes from chapter 19. We'll discuss it further as we go over to our outline section, but first of all, let me encourage you to go out onto the internet. You can either go to our website at tobelikechrist.com, where we have free PDFs that you can download and print off if you would like. They very nicely and concisely collect all the key information that we're going to be going over here. So maybe you want to save those away in your files, or maybe you want to print them off before you listen to these podcasts. They're all available, all 50 chapters for Genesis. You may also just want to make it easy on yourself, go to Amazon. There is a physical book that contains all of these outlines. It's Genesis, the 5-minute studies, and you just search for To Be Like Christ and you should be able to find it. And as I mentioned, all 50 chapters are already there, printed off for you, so you can avoid using all your toner printing these off, or having to store them digitally, and losing them. I'm not going to say that I've never downloaded some useful resources and then they ended up lost somewhere in my computer files. So whichever method works best for you, I would encourage you to go grab the PDFs. But that's what we're going to be using today. But first, before we get into the text of Genesis 19, let's talk about some context. And for today's context, we'll just go back one chapter because the events of chapter 18 relate to this one. So we've been following along with the story of Abraham. And Abraham, in the last chapter, had a meeting with 3 men. We find out that these 3 men weren't men at all, really. One of them was God himself, and then the other 2 were angels. And that's why in the very first verse of chapter 19, it talks about the 2 angels. While these 3 individuals are at Abraham's house, they reaffirm God's promise to Abraham to give him a son and to make him a great nation. God says that in 1 year, Sarah and Abraham are going to have a son, and his name is going to be Isaac. So they're really old. Abraham's like almost 100 years old. He's 99 in this chapter, and Sarah's like 90 years old. But God says, I'm still going to give you a son, and it's going to be through that son that you're going to grow into a great nation of people. After they reaffirm that promise, God and Abraham go and look over the valley where the city of Sodom and Gomorrah were located. And there's this negotiation that happens between the Lord and Abraham over the city of Sodom. God told Abraham that they had come down to inspect the city to see if it was really as wicked as they had heard. And God says that he intends to destroy it if it is in fact very wicked. Abraham says, well, Lord, we wouldn't want to see the righteous destroyed with the wicked, and certainly there's some righteous people in that city probably, so would you be willing to spare it if there were, say, 50 righteous people? And God says, okay, fine, I'll spare it for 50 righteous people. And then Abraham continues to negotiate this. Remember, the numbers keep going down and down until eventually he gets to 10. And he says, Lord, what about 10 people? There's 10 people. I know Lot, my nephew, lives there, and he has some family. So Abraham's probably thinking 10 people. There's got to be 10 people in Sodom and Gomorrah that are righteous and God-fearing. Would you spare it, Lord, for 10? And the Lord says, yeah, I'll spare it for 10. So then the Lord departs, and the 2 angels are on their way down to Sodom and Gomorrah. They're going to visit there, and that's where we're picking up in the opening verses of chapter 19. So that's our contextual foundation. Now let's go to our PDF and lay down some more foundation as far as when these events happened, who our main characters are, and where they happened. So first of all, when, I kind of already mentioned this. Abraham was born in about 1996 BC, 2,000 years before Jesus, and these events happened when Abraham was 99 years old. So this is approximately 1897 BC, or let's say 1900 years BC before Christ. For our key characters today, Abraham is not going to be really the key character of this chapter. It's going to be his nephew, Lot, L-O-T. He was a righteous man who lived in a very wicked city. He lived in Sodom. We're going to find out just how wicked this city is. We found out a little bit in our reading. If any of that was unclear to you, we'll try to clarify that and establish just how terrible this place Sodom was. And evidently the cities around it weren't any better. We also have our angels, who we just talked about. Two angels, they visit Lot in Sodom, and they warn him that the city is going to be destroyed. And then we have the citizens of Sodom, who are described in Genesis 13, verse 13, as exceedingly wicked sinners against the Lord. We're also going to talk about Lot's wife and her fate in the escape from Sodom. And then there's two other women who escape with Lot, and those are his two daughters, and they're going to be featured at the end of the chapter. We find out they are the mothers of some significant nations in biblical history that will interact with Abraham's descendants, the nation of Israel. And now finally to our where section. Where did these events play out? This is where we have our custom map on our PDF that will be really helpful. Genesis 19 centers around the city of Sodom and the town of Zoar. Now the exact location of these cities is still unknown, but most scholars place them on the southern end of the Dead Sea. I see more consistency in historians and archaeologists' guesses as to where Zoar is than where Sodom is. I've got a possible location for Zoar just on the east side of the bottom part of the Dead Sea, also known as the Salt Sea. As far as Sodom, I've seen guesses and hypotheses kind of all over the place. And so I didn't even bother to put a potential location as to Sodom's exact spot. So now that we've laid those foundational pieces, let's go to our outline, break the chapter down, try to understand exactly what we just read and how this is going to be important to the story moving forward. There's quite a bit more in this chapter, just content-wise, than in some of those before it. And you'll notice that there's quite a few more verses in this chapter than we've seen before. There's 38 verses. So I've actually got this chapter broken down into 5 sections to try to make it as understandable as possible. And the first one is just verses 1 through 3. Two angels visit Lot in Sodom. That's our title for section number 1. Two angels visit Lot in Sodom. So the two angels who visited Abraham in Genesis 18, who were with the Lord, they are on a mission to find out if Sodom is as evil as the outcry has been that the Lord has heard. So God describes it as there's this outcry from the city because it's such a wicked place and it's reached the ears of God. And so now God is sending his servants to Sodom to inspect the city. So they go from Abraham's tent down into the valley and they go to the gate of Sodom, and there Lot is sitting, and he meets them and he invites them to spend the night at his house. They tell him that they are just intending to spend the night in the public square. Maybe that was common practice, in most cities where it's safe, no problem. Spend the night in the middle of town and probably nothing's going to happen to you. But Lot absolutely insists on hosting them in his house. He will not let them spend the night in the public square, and that's telling. And this honestly makes us wonder a little bit, I think, about Lot, about his priorities, about why he would choose to live in a place that he knew that it wasn't even safe to sleep outside for one night without being attacked or harassed or worse, as we're going to see. This brings us to section number 2, which is verses 4 through 11, the title being, "The Immoral People of Sodom Surround Lot's House." You can question Lot's judgment, but he certainly had a good read on the people that he lived with, his neighbors. Because that night, after he's brought these men, these angels, into his house, all the men of Sodom surround his house, and they start demanding that these angels be brought out to them so that they can know them, which if you've read the Bible before, you'll know that that essentially means to have relations with them. And yes, that means in a sexual way. So these men have been in the city not even a full day, and the inhabitants of the city are coming to do this despicable thing to them before they can even get one night's rest. It's incredible how this news could spread through the city that quickly, and they could determine to act this kind of particular way to guests who have entered their town. I mean, there probably isn't a better way to describe them than the way that the Lord does in chapter 13, exceedingly wicked sinners against the Lord. Lot refused to let the men of Sodom touch these men or do anything to them, and he went as far as to offer his own daughters to the men in order to protect his guests. Now, this seems really, really strange, and admittedly, it is strange, and I certainly don't think that we should think that this is the ideal offer that he's making here, but in the ancient world, hospitality was taken extremely seriously, and if somebody comes into your house, you are responsible for taking care of them. So Lot here seems to think there's no other way out of this situation. He's going to have to satisfy these men's horrible appetites one way or another, and so he offers them his daughters. That's a terrible thing to do. But I think here, again, we've discussed this in a previous study, what we see here is a man's bad decisions leading him into situations where he has no good options and where every route that he can take is negative. Right? He can hand over the men or he can hand over his daughters, and those are the only two options that are in front of him. And so he has to pick one, right? And we see what he picks. But the best thing would have been if if Lot had never moved to Sodom, if he had prioritized living amongst godly people instead, and then he never would have been in this situation. So there's an application there for us as to we may be faced with horrible decisions, and sometimes that's our own fault for making horrible decisions in the past. The best thing to do is to make the right decision the first time, then we don't get led down this terrible path where there are no good options. What we find out, though, is that these men, the men of Sodom, are so horrible that they don't even take this offer that Lot proposes. They wouldn't take no for an answer. And so what they decide to do essentially is to break down Lot's door, and they press up against him, and they're going to go in and get these men by force. The angels, though, who are inside the house at this point, they save Lot by pulling him into the house, and then they strike the men outside with blindness. And the text says that they got worn out, because they're blind, probably tripping over each other, trying to find the door. It seems like they're still intent on committing their evil, even after they've been struck with blindness. But they were unable to do it, and so Lot and his household have escaped the evil intentions of the men of their city, thanks to the angels. This takes us to section number 3, verses 12 through 22. Lot and his family escape from Sodom. So do you remember what the mission of the angels was? They were supposed to come down to Sodom and find out if Sodom was really as evil as its reputation. And now they have pretty much found out and have all the evidence that they need that, yep, it's just as bad as everyone has said, and maybe worse. And you notice there's a key detail, I think, in the text. It says that when these men surrounded the house of Lot, it says that all of the men of the city came. Every last one of them came. And so what does that tell us? That there are not 10 good people in this city. There's Lot and his daughters and his wife. That's 4. But it says every single person in the city came to do these terrible things at Lot's house, which means there's not 6 others. So the angels have their answer. So the city has received its sentence, and the angels tell Lot to gather all of his family and to flee, because God is going to destroy the city for its wickedness. And so Lot goes and he tries to get these men, his sons-in-law, who are supposed to marry his daughters, to flee with him. But we find out they're not God-fearing men either. They think that Lot is actually joking when he comes to them, and they don't listen, and they refuse to join the rest of his family in their escape. We're told that when morning dawned, so the whole night has gone by, Lot hesitated to leave. We're not exactly told why he hesitates, but the angels take his hand, his wife's hand, and his 2 daughters' hands, and they bring them physically outside of the city. Lot was told to take his family and to find refuge in the hills, but he asks the angels if he can escape to this little town called Zoar, and the angel grants him that favor. Says, go there, I can't act until you get there, and he gives him specific instructions, both to Lot and to his daughters and to his wife, that they were not to look back as God destroyed Sodom. This was not something that they were supposed to see. God was going to do this behind them. They were supposed to keep their eyes towards Zoar. In section number 4, God destroys Sodom with fire and brimstone, verses 23 through 29. So this is the famous or infamous judgment that God brings about on this evil city. And it's part of the reason that societies throughout all history have known about Sodom and Gomorrah, because this is what happened to them because of their wickedness. God, quote, rained brimstone and fire on Sodom and Gomorrah, which destroyed the city, plants, and the people. So the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah were destroyed. It says that the valley was destroyed, so there may have been other cities as well that were destroyed, but it destroys everything. It's like it just completely wipes out the whole place. And so that's part of the reason why we discussed in the last chapter that nobody knows exactly where Sodom and Gomorrah are. And part of that is because they were completely leveled by this judgment that God brings upon them. There's not much left after you get bombarded with rained brimstone and fire for who knows how long, and who knows how large these stones were that were falling on the city. So Lot and his family are on their journey to Zoar, seemingly at this point basically approaching the city. Now remember, Lot and his family, they're not supposed to look back. And I imagine that would have been pretty hard. I'd be pretty curious to know what all this commotion was as sulfur-like stones are falling from heaven and there's fire coming down with them. Well, Lot doesn't look back. The two daughters don't look back, but Lot's wife gives in to the temptation, and she turns around, and we're told that God turned her into a pillar of salt. Why a pillar of salt? Well, we're not told exactly, but this is the fate that God chooses to give her. I remember that we mentioned in a previous chapter when Abraham and Lot separated, and Lot decided to go into pitch his tent near the city of Sodom. We talked about in that chapter how he made that decision probably for prosperity's sake, because that land was very good for his livestock business. But we talked about how it was going to have really bad consequences on his family in the future, and how it's always a foolish decision to prioritize the prosperity of your family over the spiritual health of your family. Well, now, as all of Lot's possessions probably were being crushed under the descent of fiery sulfur, and Lot is now escaping with his life and barely anything. He's just got his two daughters. His sons-in-law are behind him, now dead. Now his wife turns around and she suffers this fate. So this terrible decision that Lot makes, it causes him to make the terrible decision of having the terrible options of having to offer up his daughters to these evil men. We just talked about that. But now the consequences are even greater, where everything that he had is destroyed. Now all he has left out of everything is just his two daughters. He doesn't even have his wife, because she becomes a victim of his terrible decision making. So please, please, please is the application when you're making decisions that affect your future and affect the people who are connected to you. Do not make those decisions without considering how they're going to affect your relationship with God. This brings us to section number 5, which is our last section. We're going to talk about Lot and his two daughters in the cave. This section is very interesting. It's one that makes our ears perk up, especially as modern readers. It's one that I think a lot of people are looking for some kind of moral, ethical statement from God on this one after they read it. But as I mentioned in a previous study, sometimes we read these historical narratives and they're just given to us kind of matter of fact, and God doesn't step in here and tell us exactly what he thinks of the situation that we just read about. And that's what's going to happen here. We have kind of a matter of fact statement of these relationships that go on that produce these important offspring, but in terms of the ethics here, we're not getting a whole lot of information. A little bit of time has passed between the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah and the events of verses 30 through 38. Not a lot of time, but some. Lot is afraid to stay in the city of Zoar. We don't exactly know how long he was there. He stayed there for a period, and then he decides that he's afraid to stay there. And so he and his daughters go and they live in this mountain cave, this hill that's in the this cave that's in the hills. Lot was getting old. and he didn't have a male descendant to pass on his family name, kind of like Abraham in that situation. He has daughters, right? But the family's not getting passed on through daughters, so he needs a son. And what we see is that this carrying on of the family, having a patriarch of the family, is important to his daughters also. This is something that they are prioritizing. So his daughters decide that they are going to facilitate this process. Yikes. And they decide that they're going to get their father drunk, that they are going to both sleep with him and become pregnant by him in hopes of conceiving a son so that his family line can continue on. Now, their plan, however disturbing that is to us, it worked. And they gave birth to two sons. The eldest daughter gives birth to a child, Moab, and he becomes the father of the Moabites. And we're going to read about the Moabites quite a bit in the upcoming chapters of the Bible. The younger daughter gives birth to the son named Ben-Ami, and this son is going to be the father of the Ammonites. So two nations of people that are significant in the Bible account grow from this relationship between Lot and his daughters. So his line is quite significant. It does continue on. They are successful in this plan that makes us scratch our heads a little bit. But that's how the chapter concludes. Lot is spared, and his lineage is also spared. I do think even at the end of this chapter, we still see the consequences of Lot's decision-making, even though his life is spared and even though his family line does continue. Right? God does give him two sons, but one thing we can say is none of this was ideal. None of this was as good as it could have been. Lot's life is spared, yes, but not before collateral damage. Lot's line continues, but it's certainly not under ideal circumstances. I don't think there's any question of that. I mean, Lot's daughters have to get him drunk just to get him to participate in this plan of theirs. So Lot is spared, his family is spared, but nothing about this is ideal, and it could have been so much better if he had walked closer to God and closer to the path that Abraham was walking. But instead, you see how bad decisions can really mess up a person and can really mess up a family. So I think that will do it for our Bible study in Genesis chapter 19 today. Let's finish up with an application, which I always feel like I talk about our application before I really should. But that's kind of just what happens when you're talking through the text, I guess. Today's application is that surrounding yourself with ungodly people will make your life harder. Look at Lot at the end of his life. Look at his possessions. Look at his state. Look at what his daughters have to do to him. Look at his family. And then compare that to what Lot used to look like, what his life used to look like. Lot was flourishing when he lived with Abraham and when he honored Abraham's God. But his decision to move to Sodom and to make his home with these evil people cost him his peace, his family, his wealth, his dignity, I think even to a large degree. And the same is true for us and for the people around us. Surrounding ourselves with ungodly people may have certain short-term benefits, as it did for Lot. But the negative effect of those people has a detriment on our lives and souls over the long term. In 1 Corinthians chapter 15, Paul writes that evil companions corrupt good morals. The people we surround ourselves with matters. And we definitely see that in Lot. It's not just enough for you to live a personally godly life, to have good, upstanding character for just you personally, and then to think, well, the rest of who I surround myself with, that doesn't really matter. The New Testament, interestingly, describes Lot as a godly man. He had that good personal character, but the consequences of his life came about in large part because of who he surrounded himself with. He himself was godly and was trying to do the right thing on a daily basis, seems to indicate from the New Testament, right? But you can only accomplish so much when every single person around you is fighting on the other team, is on the evil side. Yes, be holy, be righteous, be godly in your personal character, but you need to be looking beyond yourself to the people around you and evaluating what they're like as well. And if they're rotten examples, you need to get rid of them and you need to find some new friends and you might need to move to another town like Lot probably should have. Lot was a godly man. His life was really messed up by the people around him. We don't want to make that same mistake. If evil companions corrupt good morals, then I think the inverse is probably also true and implied, that good companions are a benefit to good morals and will be a blessing that will improve the other aspects of your life, not make it worse. That's all I've got for today in our study of Genesis chapter 19. Lord willing, tomorrow we'll be back with chapter 20. Thanks for tuning in and listening in with me today and studying. If you have time, you can always read the chapter ahead of time before we even sit down and read it. That way you can read it in your own voice and you can hear me read it as well. For me personally, I find that there's benefits to both, and I often pick up on different things based on the way that I intake the text. So if you want to prep for tomorrow, we're going right in order, Genesis chapter 20. If you haven't left a rating in your podcast player yet, please do that. That would be really appreciated. Leave a like, leave any comments you have on the YouTube channel, and Lord willing, I'll talk to you tomorrow. We'll talk Genesis 20.